Okay, so now I'm going to go quickly over questions left over from the origin of the work of art, because we're going to come back to it anyway at the end when we get to language. But there are two things on my mind that I'm interested in. One is correcting an interesting deep mistake I've made and gotten away with for the last 20 years. I was called on it by a smart student in office hours Friday. And then I also want to just use the origin of the work of art as a transition to what we're going to do now in basic questions. Well, the mistake I made is a very subtle one, and something that the TAs and I talked about a lot, but I don't want to talk about it a lot here. But remember, I was giving an example of the world dimension. There's a struggle between earth and world. And I was saying, well, what is world? Well, world is the tendency, and Heidegger says, world is the tendency to bring things out in the open. And earth is the withdrawing, secluding, resisting, secluding aspect or function that you get when you set up a whole, when you're setting up a clearing. You get struggle to bring things into the open and the resistance that generates. And I said the world function was the 3 C's, to get things clear, consistent, and complete. and somebody said to me, who was it said this? I mean, you get credit. Who's it? Is he here? Somebody said, what? Oh, yeah, so he knows, who came and said to me, that's a way of thinking about world that is really an Enlightenment way. What you're doing is thinking about world in the modern style. In the modern style, we want to get it rationalized, as I said, using Kuhn's talk about scientific theory. We want to get it systematic. We want to get it all worked out. But that's just our way of thinking about what it is to get things out in the open. And I was illustrating in a way, illustrating without realizing it, the point I was trying to make, that the struggle between earth and worlds sets up what the translator calls a rift design. And that means that it sets up a different style or a different way things come into the open in each and struggle in each epoch. And I said, yeah, in our epoch, I should have said, look at this. We struggled to get the Constitution totally clear, coherent, and make it cover everything. That's not presumably what the medievals were trying to do with the Bible. But I don't want to go into the details because we sank into a lot of discussion when I tried to discuss with my TAs. And it's not what the Greeks were doing. I'll say a word about what I think the Greeks were doing. They certainly weren't rationalizing everything. These are the pre-Socratic Greeks, not the Aristotelian ones. But even the Aristotelian ones weren't enlightened. But anyway, the Ur-Greeks, the pre-Socratic Greeks, they were presumably trying to sharpen up the style, to get it more in focus, to bring it out. That's what shining meant to them. That's what it was to bring things into the open for them. And that struggled with darkness, which was presumably the private passions of people. For that, I'm drawing on the Oresteia, which lots of you haven't read unless you had philosophy 6 with me or some other course where they taught it. But in the Oresteia, there's this struggle between the light and the dark, this bringing things into the open and letting them flourish and bringing them out. And there is the Furies, the powers of the underground and the dark, who rebel and resist this in the name of the family, nurturing, passion, sex, privacy, all sorts of stuff that is not brought out into the open or doesn't flourish when it's brought out into the open. And so that would be a different way, different world function, struggling with a different earth function that gives you a different style. Okay, so much for that. I don't want to go into it more. If you find that you really understand what I just talked about and have more to contribute, it's a possible paper topic. It's a weird one. Okay, well now, the other thing is to just make the transition. Remember that in The Origin of the Work of Art, which is 1935, Heidegger's just getting the first glimmers of the idea that there is a history of understandings of being, or a history or a series of styles in the culture. He's making a transition which he once said, and I'll come back to this, between the transcendental hermeneutics of being and time and thinking being historically. That's a phrase from him. He says in one of the Nietzsche books that the turning in his thinking was going from transcendental hermeneutics and being in time to thinking being historically. And you can see it in here in two places, that is in the origin of the work of art. And then we're going to go to basic questions where he's already very busy thinking all this stuff historically. But on 77, I think I may have read this, did I? Tell me, where he runs quickly through the Middle Ages and the modern and stuff. I did. Did I? I think so. So he just says, in the beings opened up, we got God's creation, and that happened in the Middle Ages, and then we got objects that were controlled through calculation, and that's modernity. And then, but what I didn't read was 81, where he does it in a different way, which is sort of interesting. Remember, the thinkers are the ones who either articulate or reconfigure by finding new names for things. I said Kant articulates Descartes. Descartes' name for what he was doing were there were subjects, but by the time you get to Kant, there were autonomous subjects that were mature and so forth. So he runs in a quick way in 81 through some of the important names for the style or the being of beings. We'll talk more about that in a minute. Here he calls it being, the various names for being. And I may have not noticed this, so I'm going to just mention it. The middle of the middle paragraph, or the middle of the only paragraph on 81, being at that time, that's the time of Plato, it turns out, made its advent as eidos. We're going to hear a lot about that. The idea fits itself into morphe. That goes over to Aristotle and form. And then the synalon, the unitary whole of morphe and phyle, that's form and matter. That's Aristotle still. It's all a lot of Aristotle, namely the ergon, that's the work, that's still Aristotle, is in the manner of energeia. All of that's Aristotle words. This mode of presence becomes the actualitas of the ens actu. That's, I guess, medieval talk. The actualitas becomes reality. I don't know when that happens. That must be Renaissance, I guess. It's the only place left for it to happen. Who says it? I don't know. Reality becomes objectivity. That's Descartes. No, you know what? I bet actualitas becomes reality in Descartes. Yes, I think so. Remember, res cogitans, res extensa, I bet. And reality gets really interpreted as objectivity by Kant. After all, that's the job of the transcendental unity of apperception, to make there be objects. So, but we don't have to worry so much about the details. And objectivity becomes experience. That's his view of the extreme subjectivity of modernity. You'll hear more about that. But those are some of the crucial names that thinkers have found that, now notice, you don't want to say create a new style, but you don't want to say copy a new style. You want to say articulate the style. That is, bring it into greater focus, make it shine more, give it, make the meaningful differences clearer, and so forth. Those are also, of course, the words that might reconfigure a whole new style. Take it that, well, really, maybe even that. Never mind. I mean, try to sort this out into articulation and reconfiguring would be too hard and not something even Heidegger was thinking. I'm ready to go on to basic questions, which is going to be the lectures for the next 2 weeks, probably. I thought that it was going to be easy. When I first read it, it's deceptively simple and repetitious. I thought, how am I going to talk about this for 2 lectures? Now it seems to me, having thought about it more and talked about it with Forrest and Liz, I wonder how I can do it in 4. Well, let's start. So these are the lectures he gave a year after he wrote, after he gave the Origin in the Work of Art lecture. And one way to think about the transition is to think about that the main thing he talked about in the Origin of the Work of Art was the way an artwork, a thing, function to found a world, and so forth. And he mentioned the statesmen and the thinkers and the gods who also did that job. But now he's focusing on the thinkers and the first thinkers, namely the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle, and how they did the job of beginning the understanding of being in the West. Did I name the pre-Socratics in there? If I didn't, I meant pre-Socratics, that is. And when I say pre-Socratics, he always means Parmenides and Heraclitus. So we got how Parmenides, but he doesn't name them very often. I don't even remember if he ever named. There's Parmenides and Heraclitus, Plato and Aristotle, and he's going to focus on those thinkers and the understanding of being that they forged and what was good and bad about it. And he's also going to, and this is another way to say what's going on, and this is what I said last time, I think, that he doesn't explain enough about truth and aletheia and why he thinks aletheia is the right name for truth, and that the Greeks had something very important when they had that understanding, and that truth is correctness, is our derivative form. That's going to get all spelled out, which was very quickly gone over in the origin of the word of art. So, and so what about in the next lectures then? Maybe 3. I'm going to assume 3, but I bet it turns into 4. So today we're going to talk about Heidegger's phenomenological way of proceeding. But first we're going to I'm going to give you a kind of overall view of what the distinctions are that you're going to have to keep in mind. And then we're going to talk about the pre-Socratic and Platonic understanding of aletheia. And then we're going to talk about what went wrong in Aristotle and about the basic mood of wonder. They don't necessarily belong together. They're just the next 2 things. And finally, we're going to talk about what Heidegger understands about truth as aletheia that the Greeks missed. Remember, the important thing to remember always as you go through this, and I'm going to say a lot more about it, is this very subtle but ultimately very clear and important way that the Greeks got something right, which we've missed, but they missed something completely, which only Heidegger's got. And if you can keep those 2 things clear and keep track, you're all set. And the way to keep track, the clue, this is sort of for reading it, is that everything hinges on the tiniest thing. It hinges on an S. That is, whenever he's talking about beings and what we know about beings and what thinkers and philosophers, he says in here, what philosophers tell us about beings, plural, it's always got to do with what the pre-Socratics and Plato and Aristotle were talking about. They were talking about beings and the being of beings all the time. When it's about being without an S, then it's about what Heidegger understands, the truth of being. And so, but it goes by so fast and so subtle. It's so obvious to him, I think. But for instance, on 6, in section 3, the first sentence, philosophy is the useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of being. Well, you might have thought that he's telling you about his story, but because it sounds pretty important, and he wouldn't deny that he's also got the sovereign knowledge of the essence of beings, but he's standing on the shoulders of those philosophers who had that. He's got something even more. I don't know, something like the super sovereign knowledge of the truth of being. But as soon as you see that S, you know that everything in section 3, or no, well, I don't know. No, I think there's a transition. You know that the first 2 paragraphs, anyway, of section 3 are about the old guys' philosophers. And then you're prepared to try to watch where does the switch come. I'll show you in a minute. At the bottom of page 6, and where he gets over to his own views. But you've got to keep your eyes open. So, in fact, maybe I should skip ahead instead of saying I'm going to do that later. Let's look at that right now. Okay, so look at 6, and we'll find out about philosophers. Philosophers, well, I'm torn between this second. Which is the logical way to say? No, I will talk about it in a second. It just doesn't fit yet. Let me finish giving you the guide to reading and doing it step by step. I've always tempted to try to say everything at once. Okay. The other important thing besides the S to hold on to is remember that essence doesn't mean essence. And otherwise you're just lost reading it. It's not exactly the fault of the translator. The word is the German word Wesen, which is translated correctly by essence. But Heidegger tells you on page 30 that there is sort of the contemporary philosophical, or for a long time philosophical, and sort of empty and uninteresting sense of essence, where the essence of something is the characteristic that everything in that class has, or the necessary and sufficient conditions for being something. Like maybe the essence of care is equipment for one person to sit on. Anyway, you could try, philosophers do, to sharpen up and find out exactly what is true of all chairs and only chairs. And of course, it never works. You will find something, I'm sure, that doesn't fit my definition. But the idea, anyway, is that essence. He says this in the middle of the first full paragraph on 30. Perhaps he's saying this is wrong. He says, but perhaps the essence of the truth itself is not grasped at all if we merely represent in general that which applies universally to everything true as such. That would be the essence of truth in the simplest minded way. Now comes his own view of essence. How should we translate it? His essence of the truth, or of the care, for that matter, I guess, when you codify everything. He's interested in the big things. For him, the essence of X is either Forrest's way of translating it, which is closer to the German and then mine, and maybe the right way. I don't know. Whatever. There's no right. Whatever you find helpful. You could say the essence of X is the coming into being of X. I have to say something like the way X comes into being. Continuously happening, right? Not just the what did we say that was the other one was for us? Yeah, not coming to be, which happens only once. But coming into being, chairs aren't very good at that. But let's take something like, I don't know, I'm trying to find something less than whole big deal ontological. Being a professor, is that what you say? Yeah, okay, good. Yes, and coming into being a professor might be the days when you get the letters you got tenure. That would be coming to be a professor. Coming into being a professor is this constant thing you have to do, a lot of coordinated activities with identities and equipment and so forth. And that's the essence of professorhood. The other, and my phrase is, remember, the working of. So how truth works, or how being a professor works, I think one is a lot more colloquial, mine. Forrest is a lot closer to the German. In any case, you got to think something else than the word essence, or you'll just be lost. I mean, you have to read it. I still read it. Anytime I'm reading Heidegger, I have to consciously say to myself, every time I see the word essence, I say how it works, but I could equally well say coming into being. You really ought to just cross out essence whenever it's doing this job, and just write in whatever your favorite expression is that makes it meaningful to you. Yeah.
Except for insofar as he's explaining how we get our understanding essence.
That's right.
The double meaning.
Right, I was going to say that. Of course, don't do it mechanically or dumbly like you just pushed on the computer a substitute command, or you'll get nonsense, as you always do when you try that. But you've got to understand from the context when he's talking about essence in his sense of essence, or when he keeps talking about it the way philosophers talk about it normally, right?
And sometimes he's showing the connection
between the two. Well, we're going to get to that. Okay. Now, I'm going to get back to where I jumped ahead to this, in the right way. So I want to talk about what Heidegger's doing in the whole about I think 5 different things Heidegger's doing in this book, and it helps a lot, I think, me anyway, to sort them out and lay them out. I would be tempted to say we're going to get at Heidegger's method, but Heidegger says he hasn't got any method. He hates to talk of method. That's a Cartesian notion. That's some kind of procedure that you can follow, sort of mechanically to get the right answer. That's what the whole discourse on method of Descartes is about. And Heidegger would say that's the last thing he's doing. He says he's following a path. I wish I had a simple word for that. I can't even say Heidegger's way of proceeding, can I? Or do you think that already gets me into Descartes' procedures? Heidegger's way of doing things, I guess, it's pretty strange. Heidegger's path is just a little too Heideggerian for me. Anyway, whatever it is, the stuff Heidegger's doing. Here, let's start. Presume first, and we're going to do it with the example of truth, because that's what this book is about. So, he proceeds like any kind of analytic philosopher, making correct statements about truth, defining it as correctness, telling you more how the assertion is related to the state of affairs and so forth. He's doing that because he has to tell you sort of in terms of what philosophers are now talking about, where he wants to start. Of course, that isn't what interests him at all. There are plenty of people doing that and doing it on, and of trying to get a very clear definition of truth in a where essence means sort of what is true of all true assertions and only true assertions. What's he trying to do? Well, he's asking, secondly, about something that more basic that makes truth as correspondence, which is the answer, or correctness. Let's call it correctness. Makes truth as correctness possible. And it turns out to be a taken for granted background practices. It turns out to be, in being in time, it just turns out to be the background practice, the form of life, as the Wittgenstein. And then later it turns out there are a lot of different forms of life. I've called them different styles, different understandings of being, each of which does the job of making correspondence possible. Now, this second move is like a transcendental argument. And in Being in Time, he talks a lot about the conditions of the possibility of, and he's going to tell you the conditions of the possibility now of making true assertions. And that's why it's no surprise that he says, the sentence I already quoted, that Being in Time was transcendental hermeneutics, a kind of interpretation, never mind the hermeneutic part. He was asking about the condition of the possibility of all sorts of things. You can tell that it's a transcendental sort of claim because it's a claim about, for anywhere in the world where there are human beings, it's going to turn out to be the case that there has to be some kind of opening, we'll get back to that, in which beings can show up so that we can make true assertions about them. People make true assertions even in prehistoric times and in Bali and so forth. So there's that sort of transcendental level. Now he gets to what he's interested in. Philosophers, which are these, well, philosophers is a little confusing, and because he keeps changing his mind about what's going on. Philosophers are, in this book, everybody from the pre-Socratics to Heidegger. And Heidegger, it's not clear whether Heidegger wants to think of himself as a philosopher or not. I don't know if he ever does. The quote I said he did wasn't really him, I decided. So that's what philosophers are. What's confusing, and Heidegger thinks he's not a philosopher, he's a thinker. Unfortunately, I realized as I was preparing this clear comment, he calls these people, which he calls in here philosophers, thinkers in the origin of the work of art, because thinkers are the ones who come up with the names for the styles of being that set up the various epochs in the history of the West. So that means just as long as you don't get confused. I mean, that's a transitional state to call them thinkers. After he calls them thinkers in origin of the work of art, and calls them philosophers here, he finally gets the real name he wants for them. He calls them metaphysicians. And metaphysics and metaphysicians is really the name for it. He says, some thing I'm going to hand out in the reader, which you're going to get it soon. Everybody from, he goes clear back to Anaximander, which is 700 BC. Everybody from Anaximander through him, to him, certainly including Husserl and so forth, are all metaphysicians. And just so I won't be mysterious, metaphysicians are always talking about the being of beings with an S. Now, yeah. Isn't that interesting? Isn't that interesting? There are two ways to look at it. We'll come back to that too, but let's just say that. I mean, if you look at the people we call philosophers, let's just take one, Plato, and you consider them in what they thought they were doing, then they are philosophers or metaphysicians trying to name once and for all, this is the first crucial thing, the truth about being for everybody, everywhere, and so forth. And therefore, but if you look, as, what's your first name? John says, at what they really do, of course, you see that they don't do that at all. They help focus the style of a particular epoch, each thinker. Now, I believe, but I'm guessing, check this out, that later, after the origin of the work of art, Heidegger won't call them thinkers unless they know what they're doing. And only Heidegger is a thinker, because only Heidegger knows what he's doing. And those guys are all going to be called philosophers and metaphysicians because they really don't get it. I mean, they're doing it, but they don't know it. But I can see why one would be tempted to call them thinkers. And it's just a question, do you have any reason to think that he goes on calling them thinkers? Keep your eyes open, I will too. I have a hunch he decides to keep thinking for himself. What do you think, Forrest? Yeah. So he takes it over and gives them philosophy, gives them metaphysics. That's good enough. I mean, and he respects that a lot. And those are not insults, ever, from Heidegger. Did I see a hand? Okay, well, then I won't stop there. So they try to bring out what I call the being of beings, or the beingness of beings. Sometimes Heidegger calls it that. They know, or they sense, that there's some very important something going on, and that it's more fundamental and sovereign and determines everything else, and they try to get it and name it. He talks about this on page 6, where I was. Now this is where I said I couldn't jump ahead. You can see why it was better to wait. We're now ready to see what philosophers are, and we just said philosophy is the useless though sovereign knowledge of the essence of being. They are dealing with seeking, about halfway toward the end of the paragraph, they're seeking the most constant being in proximity to what conceals. Seeking is, that's their work. They're doing philosophy. What else is seeking but the most constant being in proximity to what conceals itself? That's the light in the room story again. That's what withdraws. That's what is so pervasive that you don't normally see it. Out of which each need comes to us, and so forth. Never mind the fancy talk. And now, and that style does not normally appear because of this withdrawal. I'm going to read that at the end of the paragraph. And what is more, about 8 lines up, and what is more concealed than the ground of what is so uncanny, namely that beings are rather than are not. Notice the S. People think Heidegger's big question is, why are there beings rather than beings? Or rather than nothing, sorry. But that's not Heidegger's question. That's the question for metaphysics. As soon as it's about beings, it can't be the right Heidegger's question. But it's an interesting question. What withdraws from us more than the essence of being? Let's see now how we want to say that. What withdraws from us more than the essence of being? Which essence is that? The essence of that which in all intelligence beings holds sway around. Well, that's pretty much like like the philosophy essence, because there the essence of being means the beingness of being, doesn't it? Because what withdraws from us is the general characteristic of all beings. Gee, I don't know why he says it that way. let's try anymore, further. The essence of that which, in all the fabricated and disposed beings, holds sway around us and bears on us, is the closest, but at the same time the most worn out, and therefore the most ingraspable. That's the style. That's the characteristic of everything. And therefore the essence of being, not the way being works. It's the most general thing about the way being is, I think. So that don't change essence there. It's not on my read. And now, switch. At the end of that paragraph, we go to the next thing. Whatever you want to call these people. Sometimes it's called thinking. Sometimes clear up to the end, Heidegger calls it phenomenology. In a very late seminar, he says phenomenology deals with what doesn't appear. Now that could have been this doesn't appear, but it's a much more fundamental doesn't appear, it turns out. And that's what we're going to talk about now. See, what I think about the withdrawing story is it's something that doesn't appear but can be made to appear. Because after all, these philosophers bring it out into the open and name it, let it shine. And Being in Time, he talks about that he wants to talk about what is nearest and yet farthest away. That is, it's nearest because it pervades everything we are and do, namely our style. Farthest away because, like the illumination, we don't normally grasp it, but which can be brought. He does say that, and after all, what else are these philosophers doing if they're not busy trying to name it, hold it up like a work of art, but with words, make it shine, glamorize the style so we can see it. But there's something else that you can't even do that with. You can't sort of glamorize it so we can see it. And now we go deeper. We've gotten to what is either phenomenology, sometimes, up to the end, or thinking. When Heidegger decides that thinking is the name for what he's doing. To posit the very seeking as a goal means to anchor the beginning and the end of all reflection in the question of the truth, not of this or that being, or even of all beings. Now we're off in the S is the signal. We're dropping the S. We're going to not even of all beings, but of being itself. By the way, I guess I should stop for a moment. I don't think it helps a bit to capitalize. I'd better say this. I mean, that's another misleading thing, besides the way essence gets translated. There's nothing false about capitalizing being. Being sein in German is capitalized. But then so is everywhere. Every noun is capitalized. So you can't just go from there to making it capital. You're pulling a little extra trick when you're translating it with a capital. Why not translate chair with a capital, or professor with a capital? They're all capital terms. So I think you shouldn't. I don't see any. If Heidegger meant that there was a super capital B on beings, he would have had it printed in gold or something, and he didn't. And if you do capitalize it, it makes it sound so much like a thing, as if it were God, as if it were some super thing, or like in Plotinus, or like the good with a capital G. I don't know how that comes from. That happens in the Greek. Don't know in Greek. But anyway, so I would say that we should be reading this lowercase b. We're not talking about this or that being, or even all beings, but being itself. But I don't think it needs a capital. The grandeur of man is measured according to what he seeks and according to the urgency with which he remains a seeker. Such questioning of the truth of being. Now, what is the truth of being? Well, that's going to turn out to be the way being discloses, or being as disclosing. That is, the truth of being, I've said before, and I still believe this, and I think maybe Forrest and I dip on this, I'm not sure. I would equate the truth of being with the clearing, with the world, roughly, with the open. And that's not the style. I mean, that's now behind the style. I mean, that's we need a name for something that every style produces. Any old style produces a clearing in which things show up as something. They produce this open. And that's not what Heidegger's going to say. Now, such questioning of the truth of being is the sovereign knowledge philosophy. Boy, see, there's where I get fairly confused. But that is a place where he uses. Liz, looks like, I mean, I thought we could say he didn't use philosophy for his own stuff, but I think he's not talking about his own stuff, because he's left beings behind. I mean, you have to sort of decode it with maybe, so I think the sovereign knowledge here is his kind of thing. Here, questioning already counts as knowing, no matter how essential and decisive an answer might be, the answer cannot be other than the penultimate step in a long series of steps of questioning found within itself. See, I think, just so you'll know why this mysterious penultimate step, when you get to the clearing, remember this? I said this last time, this mysterious refrain will keep coming up till the last book in the course where you get it head on, in time and being. If you ask her what makes it possible for there to be clearings, then you get a further thing, and that's the Erasmus, this strange business of appropriating. That in the last Heidegger, it turns out that Erasmus is what gives being or gives the clearing. And my version of that is, and it gets translated appropriating or handowning. And I said last time, but I don't know if it helps any, it's something about the way the practices work, such as they tend toward gathering, they tend toward sharpening and bringing out meaningful differences and bringing in and establishing a style and so forth. That is the ultimate step, I think. So, okay, so anyway, so the phenomenology brings you to the penultimate step, and then comes the mysterious, just to show you, right after that, on page 8, in a footnote, as if he said, well, Dreyfus needs evidence, and right, he's just come up to it, so we better give him some. The footnote says, the question of the essence of truth is the casting of one and only goal, and so and so and so. With the truth of being seen in terms of the essence of the appropriating event. That's the Invasion der Ereignis. What does it say? Okay, that's all. So there is always this sort of fun. I mean, there's always this sort of spooky thing in the background, even further in the background than any background that you've ever seen. And that's what he's talking about there. But that all comes under thinking. See, now I have a sort of a chart that I tried to fill it all out in. You've got for it, right? This part, that's what Plato do. Fortunately, philosophy in this problem too, which is this dog. I can't help it. That with this book, that's not good news. But under this, I write metaphysics, which is what that's going to become when you get good terminology. Think won't use philosophy at all anymore. Think. And what do you think? What do these people who do metaphysics? They think about the being of beings. What do these people think about the truth of being? So far. Now that we've taken this full occasion course. And in my language, I think I put brackets here, style. And over here, I haven't really explained this very well yet, but I'll just say that you must have a sense of it. I mean, when the metaphysicians talk about the style, they talk about it obviously as the way things are, now and forevermore, and in the past and everywhere. When Descartes says that people are subjects and everything else is objects, he doesn't mean now, thank goodness, people become subjects and everything becomes objects. Because now we discovered how it was all along, the people metaphysicians. So when they talk about the stuff, they don't do what Heidegger does, talk about the stone as a stone. Meaning that's just one of the ways that we can have everything showing up for us. And then comes these other mysterious things we haven't talked about yet. The essence of truth. Heidegger talks about it. Doesn't do much for me except work. But when I try to make sense of it, I hear something like the truth about the way things work, or how things really work, something like that. That's what that's supposed to be. This is supposed to be the essence of truth, unseen, and that's it. And it's good that they've discovered that. And they know a lot more. And that's something about the way truth works. And then over here is the way truth really works. And then you get this deeper story. That isn't very illuminating. I find myself very, very hard to talk, but this is the right way to put it on the board. This is how they say it. Yeah, Heidegger's going to get it one way. I mean, Heidegger thinks that they got it, remember, half right. They understood, not to be secretive about it, and we'll get into more details. Things had to be had to be unconcealed, had to come into the open before we could make correct statements. That's what they understood. They did not, the Greeks. They understood it. But a bit more and more metaphysicians missed it. Aristotle already missed it. Plato did all. But the pre-Socratics had a good feel for this. Things had to come out into the open, and that was necessary before we could say correct things. But what they didn't get is that there had to be something like a clearing before things could come out into the open. I mean, I don't know, did I write that? Yes, but I'm not going to write it here. You can write it here. Mine's really slogan. They had, I didn't write it someplace. They had coming into the open. That was what they thought everything was. And their word for this, that the style was future. Welling up, what are they, when surging up, those are the words that people use for this. And then when they sort of surged up and came into the open, then of course we could talk about this. But this is about how the open opens up. Well, this is coming into the open. Heidegger says, well, we've got to sort of understand that there's an open they come into. And then finally, listen to their writings, the open opens up. This is the penultimate question. And I haven't written that down. So
when you say the penultimate, the open, that's just the open as open.
Right. The open, this is the penultimate question. The open, but even the open as open, they don't even have a sense of, they're interested in the coming into the open business. They don't even pay attention to the open that they come into.
In the particular open.
Right, yeah. And then if I can comes along and pays attention to the particular open they come into, they're really free, aren't they? The open, oh dear, the open as open, and one of these you understand the other, because when you understand what the open is, you understand how. But then how the open opens up at all, that's their writing, this strange bottom line. What I don't really understand about it, why did I support things it's good? I think that's his work that's his word as reconfigurer and savior of humanity, to have found this word. It's going to go on for him along with Eidos and creation and Gegenstand and that is objects. There's going to be arriveness when the dust settles. But it's hard to get a feel for these things. So Heidegger would say, well, if it was easy to understand, it surely wouldn't have been the right word. So this just shows how far ahead of me he is. What?
There were three parts. The open and the open.
I think there's the open and then there's the open as open. And then how the open opens up. That's the open. And what by that I mean, I don't any of this be mysterious. That's this business of how the practices work, so that there is such a thing as the note. And that's the thing, the last thing, and it's just hinted around, like in this footnote here. It becomes more and more important until by the end of the course, as I say, it turns out to be the behind everything. Yeah. Wait, I can't. Maybe because it's noise up here. Anyway, I'll just turn on close. I have trouble here. Yeah. Oh no. Why you say that? No, it's wrong, but it's interesting. But let me see it. But it really is. It's really quite interesting and quite because the transcendental move his way is being in time, and that's where you want to find the general characteristic of the clearing or the world, and you think that that's just something that everybody has everywhere. I mean, it's still sort of metaphysical in a funny way. I mean, it's not metaphysical in that it's thinking about the being of beings. It's thinking about something called the understanding of being, meaning the clearing. But it's like metaphysics in that it thinks there is just one clearing structure, and it's been that way, and there always will be a clearing structure, and there's nothing special about the history of the West except that the pre-Socratics were onto it, but they just were onto it. I mean, it was happening all over the world, the other people just didn't notice it. Now, that's transcendental, because there it is. It's the condition, the clearing as it's described in Being in Time is the condition of the possibility of anything showing up as anything, people showing up as anything. What? Oh, there's a great place in here where he does the Being in Time story. We just jump to it as soon as I finish saying what I'm going to say to you. The reason this isn't transcendental is you're going to, the simple test is always ask yourself, is it true for everybody everywhere? And the answer is no. That there isn't one big open, except in the West after the pre-Socratics. And there isn't even arrivedness everywhere. Well, you're looking very words. And D. There are two different meanings of how much it's going. Well, if arrivedness means the tendency of the practice to order into one big world and to then produce something like a work of art that orders even more that world. And that's, remember there's this thing in the origin of the work of art which is called art, which is behind the creators and behind the artwork and draws them to do whatever they do. That isn't just the marginal practices, but that's the fact that the marginal practices want to gather, that the practices want to bring things out more and more in their own and totally. That's the picture he has now, I think. When he thinks they're arrivedness, he thinks this very special feature. This is my hunch after reading a lot of this stuff. He's a very special feature of the practices in the West that they're going to gather into one style at a time and bring that style out as fully as possible. Then there becomes, you'll get this when we get to the language essay, he generalizes it. And it turns out it happens everywhere there is language, because it turns out that there isn't just one style or one world, but lots of worlds with lots of styles all at the same time, not just a series of total worlds. I mean, think of it as polytheism. Instead of having, what happens in the arrivedness picture he's got now is it's a kind of monotheistic picture, that is, being or arrivedness is calling human beings to come together with being, and as the style and the people each come into their own by bringing each other more and more into focus. The preservers are the people acting in the style, and the style is the general way coordination of all this behavior. And these bring each out into their own most, together and total, something like that. And that's why she thinks it's transcendental. But it's exactly the reason it isn't transcendental. That is, it doesn't happen everywhere. It only happens in the West, and only since 500 BC. And this is a kind of amazing thing that Heidegger thinks. It's like saying, well, look, it's like thinking, gee, God only spoke to the Hebrews and so forth, and nobody else, and it's not a God for everybody else. It just happens that there's this super creator thing in our history. I mean, as soon as you think it's for everybody, that we ought to sort of all get everybody into our alignment, speak from our style, we're in bad shape. I mean, we are in bad shape as technology sort of takes over everybody's culture and wipes out all the other worlds and all the other styles. Heidegger is not happy about that. But what he thinks now is, at this stage in his thinking, we should once more have a unified style. Well, I can find you the quote in a minute. But Heidegger what does Heidegger really hope for? he hopes that we will have a new clearing with a new style, and that clearing with its style will have the unique feature that the work of art will not only show forth a style, but it will show forth that it's a style. And then people will understand themselves as preservers. Instead of just being preservers, they'll understand themselves as preservers. They'll know that it only exists as long as they bring it out. And that will be the last and best God in the history of the West, and it will only be a God for the West, and the West will, so to speak, be saved thanks to Heidegger. If everybody understood Heidegger. Now that's in here. I don't remember where though, where you see him sort of seeing this, hoping that this will happen. Did I write it down? Maybe I wrote it down. I did write it down, but why and where, I can't imagine. But there's a moment when he talks about this. It's got to do with their writings. If there was such a thing as indexes in Heidegger's book, we could find it in hers. Must be. Well, let me give a quick look because it would be so nice to see how it's all going to end if it works. If things go well. Upper right hand side. Here on 35. By the way, I'd be clear about why it's not transcendental. I mean, it's something just for us. But it's some very, very conditioned piece. But I see why you think it's transcendental, because it's the ultimate condition of the possibility of everything that goes on for us in the West. That's what you were on. But it's only in the West, and that's the big difference. Okay, I think on 35, when he's talking about the future.
The one that starts below on 34.
Maybe, that's what I'm thinking.
Happenings are in history are not what is bygone was considered as such.
Maybe. I mean, maybe. So, but I'm looking to see about if he's running here for the future. I don't know yet. Not quite. Not quite. But it's in this area. By the way, but I didn't find it, but I found something else. If you want to know the difference between the penultimate question and the ultimate question, the ultimate business comes up again on page 44. Well, where's the penultimate? I want to just mark it and say page 44. Okay, on page 7, you could write see page 44. Because in the middle of page 44, he says, only one thing is clear. If all philosophical thought, look at that philosophical thought, and that's just how fluctuating his vocabulary is, must more unavoidably move in this turning, the more it thinks originally. That is, the more it approaches what in philosophy is primordial, and always thought and reflected upon. Then the turning, that is the thing where we're going to get things right, must belong essentially to the single focus of the philosophical reflection, being as the appropriating event. And so it's absolutely clear that philosophical is being used all over the place here. And if you thought being is the appropriating event, and if that took over, and people all started acting in the light of an understanding of style as style, then the culture would get a new God and everything would be saved. But I can't find it. Keep your eyes open. Or maybe I read it someplace else. I was reading about 3 Heidegger things at once. Let's go back to where we are. Maybe it's going to be in this thing I'm going to have in the reader called The Way Back into the Ground of Metaphysics, because Heidegger gets all this so much clearer in a piece. It's only 14 pages long that we found while I was reading around over the weekend, that I decided that is what you're going to read next, not the nihilism as the something determination of something. I got to give you a new syllabus. I have changed my mind about that. Okay, let's go on. We're now ready for the transcendental question. I don't think he would like to call it that, but I think it's okay to call it that. You start with truth as correctness, and you ask what makes it possible. That's what starts on. Yes, it's on page 18, right. That's where I said I would show you how, for those who had being in time, where he's doing it in making this first very general move about the theory. So all this is on 18, and now I'm going to read the middle of the page. The stone is hard, well, let us reflect. If our representations and assertions, for example, the statement "the stone is hard," are supposed to conform to the object, then this being must be accessible in advance in order to present itself as a standard and so forth. In short, the being, in this case, the thing, must be out in the open. But, and then see, that's sort of interestingly ambiguous. Out in the open, namely, come out, and so that you can make true statements about it, or come into the open. But for right now, it's not clear what he's doing. Even more, not only must the stone itself, in order to remain, as our example, be out in the open, but so must the domain. And now that's the other open. One is being out in the open is this one. This one is this domain in which you can be out in the open. But being out in the open is in, where were we? So must the domain which the conformity with the thing has to traverse in order to free off it in the mode of representation. What characterizes the being in its being thus and so. That is the open. That's the clearing. Moreover, so there has to be a space in which the thing comes out into the open. And then he says, and the human being must be there, also in the open. And then he encounters the thing in the open, and then there are these fellow human beings there in the open. All of that has to happen before you can have truth.